love lives here.
Good morning, everyone. You know, it's so wonderful to be here in the sanctuary today. And I want to welcome all of you. I like looking out there and seeing everyone and just feeling that beautiful energy that vibrates throughout this sanctuary. And, you know, I was kind of kicking some ideas around my head when before, well, while Allison was talking, right? And I thought, well, she said I'm homegrown. And I thought, yeah, I really am homegrown. And I'm kind of like a cicada, right? Didn't we have this bloom of cicadas this year? Right? Well, I've been here for 17 years. And when I came to Riverside, I was looking for a home, a spiritual home. I came out of Unity, and I kind of called around to see what the Unity congregation was like, and I visited it, and it just wasn't vibing with me, right? And I called this church, and the most beautiful voice came on the line, and it was Reverend Mary. And I felt like, oh my gosh, that's where I belong. And I've been here ever since. So, this has been a wonderful transformation. And, I had a different profession. And when I retired from that, I started getting more into the spiritual part of my life. Not that it wasn't there, but I could focus almost exclusively on it. And it was so wonderful just to feel that. So 17 years later, I'm here as a part of your ministerial staff. And I just wanted to mention, Allison brought this up, and she may mention it again. On Tuesday, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee will have a webinar, and it's an Indigenous webinar titled Indigenous Resilience and Wellness, Using Spiritual Principle in Everyday Life. So we have a wonderful guest speaker for that webinar, whose name is Theta Newbreast, and I've known her since she was a young woman, student at UC Berkeley. And, it's just kind of wonderful to grow up with all of these people, grow up with you all, and grow up with someone like Theta, who has gone on to do this tremendous work out in the world. So I'm just welcoming all of you here. I'm so happy that you're here. And I'm just so happy that we can be here celebrating. And for all of those people who are watching us virtually, welcome. We feel your energy too. And I just have to mention that the band was awesome this morning, right? And when Manny walked in with those drums, that raised the roof, right? So here we are. We've got all of this joy, all of this energy, and all of this love that we're sharing today. This month we've been exploring what it means to be in community. And in the early, and we've been looking at a proverb. And in the early 20th century, a proverb began circulating throughout the world that presaged the current interest in, you know what, my eyes are getting worse. Okay, I'm going to have to hold this a little bit closer. Began circulating throughout the world that presaged the current interest in re-examining human collectivity rather than the cult of individuality that Western culture has mythologized as the highest realization of human beings. So that's been the norm, right? And in the 21st century, something else started to emerge. A different kind of look at what we are becoming. And the emerging trend of turning towards community and collectivity can be summed up in the reworking of a proverb that is attributed to parts of Africa, both East and West Africa. The Luho rendition says, "Alone a youth runs fast, with an elder slow, but together they go far." What has emerged in popular culture for the past 20 years or so is alone you can go faster, together we can go further. The latter accentuates teamwork and cooperation, while the Luho proverb emphasizes the naivete of youth and the wisdom of age, combining to carry us further. These are complementary energetics that are both necessary. I like looking at both of these readings to take our 21st century pulse on how we feel about community right now. And I'm just going to step back into the 20th century and then into the 19th century. So the adage that was circulating then, mentioning this individuality or the cult of individuality was, he who travels alone travels fastest. That was what was emphasized, just that part. And look at what a tremendous shift occurs when we amplify this proverb and deepen into it. And what does that feel like? Oh my gosh, that's a huge, huge difference. Desmond Tutu says, "We are living in a historic moment. We are each called to take part in a great transformation. Our survival as a species is threatened by global warming, economic meltdown, an ever-increasing gap between rich and poor. Yet these threats offer an opportunity to awaken as an interconnected and beloved community." Unquote. The great transformation has both a spiritual and material aspect to it. We are spiritual beings having a human incarnation, as Reverend Michael Beckwith likes to remind us. And each of these aspects is holy, both the spiritual part of us and the material part of us. To be human is to be holy. As we transform our consciousness to take into account our responsibility for ourselves, our communities, and ultimately the planet, we simultaneously radically alter the material conditions of life. There is more than enough for everyone to live with their basic needs met: food, clothing, housing, education, healthcare. And yet, we are still struggling to move out of that old paradigm and that old narrow way of looking at things that rests in the belief that we only look out for ourselves, our narrow self-interests. There isn't enough to go around. I'll get mine. And maybe most dangerous of all is the belief that more material goods or money is better. This thinking leads to foolhardy behavior that puts everyone in jeopardy. Okay, one of the most influential researchers on happiness is the psychologist Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. I had to practice that a lot to say that. Whose more than 4 decades of work uh, shows that once a basic standard of living is reached, once we have just that basic amount of money, it doesn't really add to our happiness. It doesn't do that. Not even a little bit. Of course, there are things that money helps with, right? If we have shelter and we can pay our rent, yeah, that really helps. But once we get to that point, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't automatically mean that we are happier. And it doesn't, the research shows it doesn't work like that. And he coined a term called flow to speak about optimal human experience that has nothing to do with more material goods, but everything to do with more engagement with life. When one is in the flow, the results are more joy, greater happiness, greater intrinsic motivation. Wow, I like how that sounds. More motivation, increased engagement, improved performance, more learning and skill development. The more is how we experience life. That's where the more comes in. Experiencing life. That's the more. Being in the flow gives us a taste of self-transcendence that comes from the mystical union with God. Of course, we could have peak experiences and in one area of our life and be completely detached from community or the common good. There are many examples of people who excel in their vocations or professions, and they have these peak experiences galore. But nonetheless, rather, they don't move beyond that. It doesn't go into the rest of their life because they haven't gone beyond living from the ego. They feel alienated or separate from others and ultimately from spirit. And you can probably think of some examples of this and, think of someone who is a great actor or a great musician or a great surgeon, and yet they have all of these personal problems in their life, right? But they can have the peak experience in their profession. And, I want to talk about the ego a little bit because so often we pose the ego as the villain in our story, right? And I don't want to do that today. I want us to have some compassion for those egos. Freud, who formulated a theory of ego, and he's considered the founder of modern psychology, he saw the ego as a tragic figure. A tragic figure. And that's probably why the ego behaves in the way that it does, because it's so overworked. Just think about it. Think about what the ego is set up to do. It's charged with protecting us and running interference for us as we move through the world. And all of the challenges and perceived threats that we have about living in the world. Andrew Cooper points out that, quote, it is at once the reality principle and the seat of anxiety. Does that sound familiar? Being saddled with mediating conflicting demands, controlling instinctive impulses, withstanding the superego's perfectionist recriminations, and negotiating the endless travails on the path of life is no picnic. Right? Unquote. My God, it is no picnic for our poor egos. So let's give some gratitude and kindness to our egos and let them have more time off through our spiritual practices. We are also fortunate to have spiritual laws to point the way for us. One of the universal spiritual laws that humans have been given by the prophets and sages of all peoples of the world is the Golden Rule. Religious studies scholar Karen Armstrong offers this, quote, compassion is aptly summed up in the Golden Rule, which asks us to look into our own hearts, discover what gives us pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on another. Unquote. To live the Golden Rule is the height of spiritual maturity. If we could just live that one rule, we would be living in peace and we would be living in that paradise that we know was created for us. One of the most influential spiritual thinkers of the 20th century was Martin Luther King Jr., who tasked us with building the beloved community. You know, that's where that term comes from. He's the one who made it rise up in our consciousness. You know, we've talked about community, we've lived in community forever, but this is something that he brought forward out of this crucible of all of these kinds of things that, you know, all of that pain and suffering that was inflicted on oppressed people. He was able to crystallize that idea for us and to set that as our sight for our future. This is where we're going. We're building, we're enacting and embodying the beloved community. And he says, love is creative and redemptive. Love builds up, and hate tears down and destroys. The aftermath of the fight with fire method is bitterness and chaos. The aftermath of the love method is reconciliation and creative of the beloved community. Yes, love, which means understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill, even for one's enemies, is the solution. Oh, and let's put that next to Ernest Holmes, what Ernest Holmes says. One of the things that resonates with me in our teachings is Ernest Holmes' final sermon by the sea at Asilomar in 1959. And as the founder of religious science, he said, "Find me one person is for something and against nothing, who is redeemed enough not to condemn others out of the burden of their soul, and I will find another Savior, another Jesus, and an exalted human being." And if we put those side to side with the quote by Martin Luther King Jr., don't we see that in Martin Luther King Jr.? And don't we see that in the founder of religious science, Ernest Holmes? There's tremendous confidence and optimism in Ernest Holmes' statement. It's transcendent because it points to the human experience that no longer creates enemies, which is exactly what Martin Luther King is pointing to too, right? Well, in the beloved community, there are no enemies. Absolutely none. Absolutely none. When we're all in, our whole being is in for human liberation, and we give our egos the rest they need, we create the conditions to live in the exalted state. And we create the beloved community. One of my favorite shows right now is Ted Lasso. Has anyone watched it? Some people? Okay. I love that show. And the tagline that comes up whenever you put it on is kindness makes a comeback. I love that. I believe it is so popular because it characterizes or it demonstrates some of our deepest yearnings as human beings. Basic kindness and compassion in a world that is filled with complicated relationships, complicated beliefs, and rash behaviors. It is a tender series with tender characters who combine the qualities of the two proverbs I began this talk with. In the series, there is the energy and naivete of youth combined with wisdom of the elders who are themselves still growing, and the ideas of teamwork and going further than is possible to go alone. We can equate the team with the beloved community. The economics and power struggles of the sports complex are present, but Ted's commitment to kindness and the personal development of each of the players is paramount to him. He's there for them. He's all in for them. The episode that sticks with me is when Danny Rojas makes the kick that kills the mascot of the team, this pretty little greyhound. And he is the most upbeat, enthusiastic player on the team who always shouts blissfully, "Football is life." That's his energy, right? It's football is life. Suddenly, he's thrown into an existential crisis when football is not always life. His depression and aversion to getting back into the game are beyond the skill level of even Ted Lasso. And I learned a term in the series. It's called the yips. Maybe people who know sports have heard it. I never had, but they said he had the yips. And I listened to George Mumford this morning, and he talked about the yips. And I thought, oh, okay, that's a real thing, the yips. And, and I started thinking about, yeah, there's been times when I had the yips, right? Sometimes when we have to, getting up here on Sunday morning, sometimes I get the yips, am I going to have the right words? And I go off in my head into that ego space of fear and all of that. Well, Danny Rojas finds himself in this place of crisis. And the coach can't do anything about it. So Dr. Sharon Fieldstone is called in to help Danny Rojas and the entire team. The realization that football is also death frees Danny from depression and the inability to play. He comes back stronger than ever when he's able to embrace all of life, which also includes death. And he epitomizes being in the flow. After his epiphany, flow has an added dimension. You know, it's not all about football is life. It has this broader feeling to it. Football is also complicated. Football also has other consequences. And yet, in order to get over the yips and be the best player that he can possibly be, he has to embrace all of it. And that transformation is a transcendent moment in the series. What we see on the screen is interdependence with team members, coaches, the staff, the owner, and even the fans and sports commentators and the journalists who follow the team. This is a microcosm. You know, this is another example of how the beloved community can take place in every kind of situation. So that series, centering kindness, centering that idea that we are all in this together, that we can go further together than we can alone, is so powerful. And there's so much scientific evidence now to back this up, you know, to back up this ancient wisdom, this real ancient wisdom. You know, we do find ourselves with 21st century challenges that are tremendous. And we have come so far in our spiritual evolution too. Ernest Holmes reminds us in his final sermon by the sea what we are about as religious scientists. Quote, "I would that we should not build out of the body of our simplicity, grandeur, and beauty other creeds loaded with superstition, a fear of the unknown, and a dread of the unseen. We have discovered a pearl of great price. We have discovered the rarest gem that has ever been found, setting in the intellect of the human race. Complete simplicity, complete directness, a freedom from fear and superstition about the unknown and about God." Unquote. As we take this into our hearts, knowing that we have simplicity, grandeur, and beauty as our foundation, as we practice self-mastery, we cannot be overtaken by superstition, like the grand conspiracy theories that have been resurrected by fearmongers. We know that God is all there is. And as we come into deep communion and mystical union with the divine, we are all emissaries of the beloved communities. Thich Nhat Hanh says, the larger your beloved community, the more you can accomplish in the world. We build the beloved community, and we know that love lives here in the hearts of all of us. We allow it to flow, and so it is. Let's turn within. and just resting in the knowledge that God is all there is, and love is ever present. I know that, there is only one power and in one presence in me and in all the world, and that is God, the good, magnificent. That is exactly who each and every one of us is as well. Everything that God is, we are. And as we step into this flow of life, as we step into accepting everything that life has to offer, as we enter into the challenges of life with great, great joy, we come out ever stronger. Every one of us who made it here today through the challenges of making our way through an incredible maze, we grew out of that experience. And that's exactly what we do in life. And I know that's what life is for, as our personalized curriculum to come closer to God, to come closer to one another, and to know that we are never separate from life and its ever process of creation. We are a part of that. We are it. We are one. And I allow all of this good to flow over us. And so it is.
Love